Okay, welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology here at AWC. Let's take a look at the gross anatomy of skeletal muscles here. Now, a skeletal muscle, we can see here, is actually an organ. The skeletal muscle itself, right, is the organ. We can see there it is. It contains all of the different tissue groups. So it contains connective tissue. You can see the connective tissue covering referred to as the epimysium in this case. You've got a paramysium as well and an endomysium. These are all connective tissue coverings. So it's got a connective tissue covering to it. We can see that there's other tissues involved. We can highlight some nerves and arteries here. So nervous tissue, vascular tissue as well. So connective tissue, some more forms of connective tissue that make up this organ that is the skeletal muscle. And so skeletal muscle is highly vascularized. It's also highly innervated, meaning that it has a lot of blood flow. It also has a lot of nervous connections as well. And because skeletal muscle tissue has a high metabolic rate, it needs a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients from the bloodstream. Another organelle that we might also see in abundance of a muscle fiber or cell is a mitochondria, right? Like that's an energy producing organelle. And so high oxidation, high energy. We're going to see quite a bit of mitochondria as well. And because skeletal muscle is voluntary, each muscle must have a nerve that innervates each cell to stimulate a contraction. Now, each skeletal muscle here is composed of a large bundle of what we may call fascicles. So if we zoom in here, we have each skeletal muscle here made by a bundle of fascicles. So now a fascicle is a group of muscle fibers in a group, right? So if we put a bunch of muscle fibers together, we get a fascicle. If we put a bunch of fascicles together along with the connective tissue covering and the neurovascular bundle, what we get is a skeletal muscle. And so each fascicle is composed of a number of muscle cells, or perhaps we should say it better, muscle fibers. As well, each muscle fiber is composed of the protein structure myofibril. So now if we're looking from bigger to smaller, each skeletal muscle is made up of a fascicle. Each fascicle covered by the paramysium, which we'll talk about here a little bit later, is a bundle of muscle fibers, right? So a bundle of muscle fibers creates a fascicle. And ultimately, the myofibril is a protein structure that gives shape to the muscle fiber. And so a bunch of these myofibrils put together form a muscle fiber. So not only do we have this myofibril, we can also see that there's nuclei. There's going to be mitochondria located inside this muscle fiber as well. There's also going to be some neurovascular bundles, right? We can see the nerve innervating this muscle fiber and blood flow as well. We'll have some lymphatics and veins as too. So again, each skeletal muscle is composed of a bunch of fascicles. Each fascicle is composed of a number of muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber is composed of myofibrils. Now let's focus in a little bit on this myofibril. The myofibril, if we zoom in here, is made up of thick and thin filaments. We can see here that there's an alternating pattern of thick and thin filaments that makes up this myofibril. You can see that the thin filaments are on the outside of the thicker filaments here, and we can also see some of the descriptive terms or sections of the myofibril as well. And so each myofibril, as we've mentioned here, is composed of, let's get my pen out, is composed of myofilaments. Oh, excuse me, let me go back. And so each myofibril is composed of myofilaments. Let's see if I can't highlight those terms. We'll use my highlighter here. So each myofibril made up of myofilaments. Those myofilaments include the thin filament. Now the thin filament is called actin. So we'll give that a separate color. Let's pick a green perhaps, right? We can see that the thin filament is called actin. And we'll highlight that there. And the thick filament, which I'll highlight in blue here, the thin filament is called, the thick filament is called myosin, right here. I'll highlight that. Ooh, that's a pretty thick one there. But the thick filament, or the thick myofilament, is called actin. So there's the thick filaments. We'll highlight there. And then it's surrounded by those thin filaments. I'll kind of make it a more thin color here. Yeah, it's really thin. There it is. And so this myofibril is made up of a number of these different patterns here. And so it's created in a what we'll identify as a sarcomere. So the sarcomere goes from one end here to the other end. So it contains alternating thick and thin filaments. It goes from, let me identify here, it goes from one Z disc to the other Z disc. And we can see that here on the line here. So a sarcomere, sarco refers to flesh, mere refers to a small unit of. What we have is a sarcomere. It goes from one end of one Z disc to another Z disc. And so in doing so, what we have is the functional units which allow the muscle to contract. Let me go back here and highlight just what we've looked at. Right, and we can see that here at the bottom of the screen. The myofilaments of myosin and actin are arranged in an overlapping pattern, creating hundreds of thousands of functional units called sarcomeres. So the sarcomere goes from the Z line, we can see the Z line here, and from the other Z line here. So this is an actual functional unit of the myofibril. And so you can see in the picture here, there's one sarcomere, here's another sarcomere, and then the third sarcomere. So we can imagine if this is a long cylindrical shape that we can have hundreds of thousands of these, hundreds or even thousands of these in a single unit. Now each skeletal muscle has 3 layers of connective tissue. This connective tissue is called myosa, and this connective tissue encloses the provided structure and holds the muscle as a whole. It also compartmentalizes the fibers within the muscle as well. So each muscle is wrapped in a sheath of dense, irregular connective tissue called the epimysium, which allows a muscle to contract and move powerfully while maintaining its structural integrity. The epimysium also separates the muscle from other tissues and organs in the area. But this is where we have the epimysium, right? And then it'll blend into the tendon, which is the structure that will ultimately blend into the bone, the periosteum. And we've talked about this when we saw this in the bone structure. The periosteum is the dense, irregular connective tissue covering of the bone. And so the epimysium blends into the tendon, ultimately blends into the periosteum of the bone. So the muscle blends into the bone through the epimysium, the tendon, and the periosteum. So let's take a look at these connective tissue coverings of skeletal muscle. So each muscle surrounded by an epimysium. This is what will also blend into the tendon and surrounds the entire muscle. The epimysium surrounds the muscle from the surrounding tissues and organs as well. It's sometimes referred to as the deep fascia. The perimysium is located around each muscle fascicle. So remember that each skeletal muscle is comprised of a number of fascicles. Well, each fascicle is covered by the perimysium. Inside each skeletal muscle fibers are arranged into individual fibers or into individual bundles, each called a muscle fascicle, and they're covered by a connective tissue covering called the perimysium. This fascicular organization is common in muscles of the limbs, particularly. It allows the nervous system to trigger a specific movement of a muscle by activating a subset of muscle fibers within a bundle or a fascicle of the muscle. And then finally, inside each fascicle, each muscle fiber is encased in a thin connective tissue layer of collagen and reticular fibers called the endomysium. The endomysium contains the extracellular fluid and nutrients to support the muscle fiber. These nutrients are supplied via the blood to the muscle tissue. In muscles that work with tendons to pull bones, the collagen in these three layers ultimately intertwines with the collagen of the bone, and at the end of the tendon, it fuses with the periosteum, as we mentioned. So a little bit more of a descriptive picture here. We can see the skeletal muscle. This is the entire skeletal muscle structure, right? We can see skeletal muscle, and the skeletal muscle is surrounded by the epimysium. The skeletal muscle is composed of a number of muscle fascicles. So each grouping of here is the muscle fascicle. And as we zoom into each muscle fascicle, what we'll see is that the covering of the muscle fascicle is the perimysium, and each fascicle is contained by a muscle fiber. So you can see that these muscle fibers are there. And now each muscle fiber is surrounded by the endomysium and contains myofibrils, right? Myofibrils. So you can see that endomysium and the myofibrils. And now stay tuned, because in the next section here, we'll be looking at the microscopic anatomy of the muscle tissue here, where we look at the myofibril. So here we have that myofibril, that protein structure that helps to make up a particular muscle fiber. We can see the alternating thick and thin filaments. You can see the thick filament, thin filament, thick filament, thin filament. From Z line to Z line, we have the sarcomere in front of us. There's a specialized endoplasmic reticulum covering called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And again, each myofibril is made up of sarcomeres, right? Sarcomeres. From one Z line to another Z line, we define the sarcomere. It has alternating thick and thin filaments, as you can see here. But stay tuned as we continue our adventure through the macroscopic and now looking into the microscopic anatomy of a muscle cell. Then we get into muscle physiology. I look forward to seeing you guys in the next installment. Until then, take care and stay safe.